I'm Robert Kennedy Jr., and in this PodFast episode, I'd like to give you a summary of my recent conversation with the besties on the All In podcast. In it, we discuss my view on the war in Ukraine, government spending, the media, and the American educational system. Here are 7 key takeaways from my conversation on the All In podcast. Key takeaway number 1. How the U.S. government's objectives in Ukraine are fueling controversy and casualties. I want to make it clear that I initially supported humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but have grown increasingly concerned about the U.S. government's objectives. I believe the U.S. is prolonging the war and maximizing casualties in an effort to force regime change in Russia, contrary to the humanitarian mission initially claimed. I revealed that my son served in Ukraine, fighting alongside the Foreign Legion in the Carpathian Offensive. I argue that the war has taken a toll on Ukrainian youth, with over 300,000 dead. I believe the U.S. and Ukrainian governments are hiding the true extent of casualties, which are some of the highest since World War II. I trace the origins of the conflict back to 2014, when the U.S. government supported the overthrow of Ukraine's democratically elected government, leading to a pro-West, anti-Russian government taking power. This sparked Russia's invasion of Crimea and the subsequent civil war in Ukraine. If elected, I would immediately work to establish a ceasefire and seek to settle the war in Ukraine. I would also reconsider sending armaments to Ukraine, as I believe the country cannot fight without U.S. support. When comparing the foreign policies of recent U.S. presidents, I see Biden as a go-to-war guy and appreciate some aspects of Trump's policy on disentangling the U.S. from constant wars. However, I criticize Trump for walking away from the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which I see as a provocation to Russia. I also question the need for NATO expansion and suggest that the U.S. should work to de-escalate tensions with Russia. I propose pivoting from a containment strategy to one that brings all parties to the table for a resolution, even if that means taking NATO expansion off the table. Key takeaway number 2. My plan to tackle national debt and prioritize America's middle class. As a presidential candidate, I believe our national debt, now at $32 trillion, is alarming, especially with military spending accounting for a significant portion. We spend $1.1 trillion a year on military and homeland security, which I think could be better used to rebuild our middle class and strengthen our economy at home. Instead of being the world's policeman, we should focus on making America a fortress that's too expensive to conquer. To balance the budget, we must explore cutting defense spending and reconsider our priorities. While I don't have a clear answer on whether we should restructure retirement benefits, Medicare or Medicaid, or raise taxes, I know we must impose fiscal discipline. We shouldn't gamble with the full faith and credit of the United States by playing political games with the debt ceiling. As for our social safety nets, I believe we should not touch Social Security or Medicare. We must take care of our citizens who have paid into these systems their whole lives. Our focus should be on taking care of our people and addressing the real problems our nation faces, instead of playing a game of chicken with the debt ceiling. Both Republicans and Democrats must be willing to negotiate and put the country's best interests first. If elected, I am committed to working with both sides to find a solution that benefits all Americans. Key takeaway number 3. I vow to challenge government agencies and champion transparency. I had the opportunity to discuss my thoughts on government agencies and the deep state. I shared my ideas on how I would handle intelligence agencies based on my father's experiences with the CIA. I firmly believe that the CIA was involved in my uncle's assassination, and if elected president, I intend to rethink the roles of the CIA, FBI, and DOJ. I also emphasized the need for increased transparency and accountability within government agencies. I mentioned individuals like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, who have exposed truths that are important for Americans to know. I advocate for the protection of whistleblowers rather than their punishment. While I don't believe in a deep state conspiracy against Trump, I do recognize that corruption is systemic within agencies like the CIA, USDA, and EPA. I call for unraveling this systemic corruption across the government in order to restore the integrity and effectiveness of these agencies. Overall, my insights offer a thought-provoking perspective on the role of government agencies and the need for transparency and accountability in our political system. Key takeaway number 4. I see risks and research gaps in the development of vaccines. Although I am fully vaccinated and so are my children, I now wish I had not made that choice due to my understanding of the risks involved. Childhood vaccines are exempt from pre-licensing safety testing, which is a significant concern. When I was a child, I received 3 vaccines, but my children have received 72 doses of 16 different vaccines, none of which underwent placebo-controlled trials before licensure. I attribute the dramatic increase in vaccine production to the 1986 law signed by President Ronald Reagan that granted vaccine manufacturers immunity from liability. This created a gold rush for the industry, resulting in a rapid increase in the number of vaccines administered. I've observed a chronic disease epidemic in the United States, with rates of chronic diseases skyrocketing since 1989. Conditions like ADHD, autism, allergies, and autoimmune diseases have become prevalent. I believe there is a connection between the explosion of chronic diseases and the increasing number of vaccines, as many diseases are listed as potential side effects of vaccines. However, I acknowledge that other factors, such as environmental pollution and dietary changes, have also contributed to this epidemic. The lack of research on vaccines' long-term effects is alarming. For example, the DTP vaccine, which was discontinued in the US and Europe due to severe side effects, is still administered to millions of children in Africa. A study found that girls receiving the vaccine died at 10 times the rate of unvaccinated girls from unrelated diseases, suggesting the vaccine compromised their immune systems. This highlights the importance of conducting placebo-controlled trials before introducing vaccines, especially when mandating them for healthy individuals. Key takeaway number 5. I believe in embracing clean, cost-effective energy solutions to power the future. Currently, nuclear power is considered too risky and not safe enough. The insurance industry won't even provide coverage for it. Look at Fukushima. They're poisoning the Pacific with deadly radiation, and their only solution is storing contaminated water in massive tanks with no end in sight. Nuclear power plants are extremely expensive to build, costing between $9 and $16 billion, and that's not even considering the costs of technicians, waste disposal, and other expenses. I am a strong believer in free market capitalism, and I think our energy system should reflect that. Solar and wind energy are much more cost-effective and environmentally friendly, with solar plants costing about $1 billion per gigawatt and wind plants around $1.2 billion per gigawatt. The main obstacle we face is the lack of an efficient grid system to transport renewable energy from sources like wind farms in North Dakota to the rest of the country. We need to invest in a DC grid system that can efficiently move electrons across the country. As president, I would support research into safe nuclear fission production systems as long as they can compete in the marketplace and clean up their mess. Nuclear energy providers need to show us how they will deal with waste and internalize their costs rather than externalizing them onto the public. I'm open to exploring various energy sources, but they must be competitive, safe, and environmentally responsible. Key takeaway number 6. When it comes to sports, gender, and education, I believe in respecting choices and balancing equity. I believe in bodily autonomy, and people's choices about their bodies should be respected without shame. However, I don't think a biological man should compete on a women's sports team, as it may jeopardize the progress women's sports have made towards equity. Regarding gender reassignment surgery, I think it should be an adult's choice. Children should not make such decisions without parental permission. We need to approach this issue with understanding and respect, striving to solve problems and provide people with the freedom to exercise their choices. When it comes to critical race theory, we should be honest about our history of racism and genocide, not to shame people, but to learn from our past. We should teach a balanced view of history, including the positive aspects of America's achievements and values. In terms of education, I believe we should invest significant resources into public schools, striving for excellence. Cutting back on unnecessary military spending could help fund improvements in education. As for educational diversity, vouchers, and charter schools, I recognize the appeal of free market principles in education, but my primary focus is on making public schools the best they can be. I'm open to exploring these issues further and finding the best solutions for our educational system. Key takeaway number 7. I fight for truth and open discussion. In 2015, I wrote a book on thimerosal and was involved in a documentary called Trace Amounts. Despite having a close relationship with Fox News founder Roger Ailes, I was not allowed to discuss the documentary on the network. Ailes explained that 70% of their primetime revenues came from pharmaceutical ads, and they couldn't risk offending their biggest advertisers. In another instance, I worked on a Rolling Stone article about a secret meeting between CDC officials and vaccine companies. Jake Tapper of CNN spent 21 days working with me on an exclusive story, only for it to be pulled by corporate the night before airing. I've also experienced censorship at ABC, where an interview I gave was heavily edited, removing my side of the conversation. These experiences demonstrate how dissenting views are often labeled as misinformation and suppressed. In my case, I've been accused of promoting misinformation, but I challenge my critics to identify specific false statements I've made. I rely on a robust fact-checking operation and a large advisory board of MDs and PhDs to ensure the accuracy of my statements. As I campaign for the Democratic nomination, I'm committed to sticking to the truth and engaging in open discussions on issues that matter to the American people. I believe in changing my opinions in the face of new facts, but those facts must be presented to me first. I'm Robert Kennedy Jr., and I'd like to thank you for listening to this PodFast summary of my conversation on the All In podcast. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. See you next time.